I'd like to ask a naive question, which is, what is the purpose of a citation?
To protect yourself from accusations of plagiarism.
That's one. Another is so that you don't have to explain everything to the reader. He can go look it up. And it gives credit to those who've gone before.
Yeah, well, it's the anti-plagiarism thing. I mean, I point that out because in Germany, there's been a number of high-ranking cabinet people who have to give up their doctor title because some software has gone through and checked their theses and found that there are all sorts of uncited statements which they lifted from other places, maybe.
So far, I've got protection against plagiarism. In other words,
well, to give credit where it's due, yes.
Well, protection against plagiarism is
that's the same thing.
The protection against plagiarism, give credit, help the reader find things. That's what Phillip said.
Well, in our field, the beginning of a paper starts off with an introduction, which says what you want to go, what you're going to do, and then it goes, and the state of knowledge that we have at the moment. Where do we stand now on this project? And there's an awful lot of credit that has to be given to that. We say things have been studied here by so-and-so and so-and-so, and then later on it's been added on by so-and-so, and then this is why we need author years. We can't do this with all numbers. So we're referring to people and when they, and with their years and when they did this, and then we said, that's the state of things now. Now here's what we're going to do. So nobody starts from scratch on this thing. You have to establish the state of knowledge from which you are starting.
Yeah, and you can't even summarize it all. It would just take too long. There's a mathematics book by Russell and Whitehead, and I think it's after several hundred pages they finally prove 1 + 1 is 2. You can't go back to the beginning and explain everything, and so it's much easier to cite the major reviews and then cite important articles since the last major review. And so anyone who's interested in the details can just go look it up. And especially in some fields, I mean, like some people make including the original author of BibTech, I believe, that a numerical citation style is more aesthetic, it's better for the reader and so on. And some journals use it because it's more compact. But if the readership is familiar with the major articles in the field and you're reading something and you see Smith and Jones 82, and every reader knows what that is because it's a famous paper, that's much more efficient than superscript 17 or whatever.
Yeah, especially if you're working with you've got several papers in front of you and they're all referring to the same paper, some other paper, and there are different numbers in each of these things. And it's much easier if they're all Smith and Jones 1982. That's blah 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 in all these papers. You know what they're referring to. But it probably, as you say, it depends on the context of the study of the field.
Yeah, there's one more really important use of literature citations, and that is if you think of them as forming a tree. This paper you're currently reading fans out into a number of others, and papers that come after this paper may cite this paper and so on. And if you invert that tree, as the Journal Science Citation Index did for many, many decades, it's now essentially become Web of Science. You can now find any paper in that field and you can follow the citations backwards into the history, but also forwards into what people are doing now. So even if you found paper, say from 50 years ago in your area of interest, you can find out where people are in the field now. And that's important if you're moving into a new field where you don't know the current work. And yet with an inverted citation index, you can quickly find the important stuff and bring yourself up to speed fairly quickly.
I'd like to add another thing, which is that a good citation will help the librarian find the item, and particularly if it's to a reference to an old book.
Yeah, and that's why things like unique identifiers for papers in the form of DOIs and books with ISBNs and journals with ISSNs and so on, those are important because they really can help you find something. And if you look at the European journal history in particular, there are famous journals in German and French and English and Italian that have extraordinarily long names, 50 words or more in some cases. It's essentially the same journal, but over the last 300 years, it's had 10 different names, and it gets cited in different ways. And then you have journals like Zeitschrift für Physik, the German physics journal, which changed the volume numbering. They have different series, and so they have one volume number which goes from the first series forward, and then they have a volume number within the series. And if all you have is a single number for that volume and you're lacking, say, a year, you could be off by 150 years in your citation. So getting better bibliographic data matters, and that's why I've put a lot of effort into trying to ensure that whenever DOI data are available, they do go into the bibliographies, and I've created extended styles that will support their inclusion in bibliographic styles.
And they're being added retroactively to older
Right.
journalism.
The American Math Society has this very nice facility called MREF, which, unlike MathSciNet, which is a paid-for subscription service, MREF is totally free. And you can simply paste in the text of a reference list entry from a paper. And if it's in the area of mathematics that they cover, it does pattern matching on it to try to determine the exact article you're referring to, and will give you a BibTeX entry for it. And journals like those from the AMS and also many other big publishers are doing exactly that sort of thing to retrofit bibliographic data into their journal metadata archives. A number of journals now, even though the journal itself is a subscription journal, the reference list is available in the metadata free. And so you can quickly find who this paper is citing, even if you don't have the money to pay for the article or the access to it.
So one of the important things of references is that they're an indicator of influence. And to have a paper that is well cited by eminent people is good for your career.
Yes, and this has led to a whole field that's called science citation metrics. There's at least half a dozen journals in this field that I track. One of them going back, I think, about 70 years, but most of them are more recent, from the last 20 years or so. And in some areas of science, your citation index is very critical for promotion. I have colleagues in the Department of Chemistry who can tell you their number as of last week. Whereas in my department of mathematics, I don't think I've ever heard any of my colleagues discuss it. So it is a concern, and it has both good points and bad points. One of the bad points, of course, is that if you work in a big field where lots of people are writing lots of papers and doing lots of citations, you might have a high citation index. But if you work in a narrow area of research where you're one of a few, and you only produce a paper every few years, like many mathematicians do, you'll have a tiny one. And it seems to me to be unfair to use a citation index number to choose between two individuals in different departments as to whether they get promoted or not.
Well, you might end up promoting the people who know how to game the system, which might be appropriate in some circumstances.
Oh, indeed. And that gaming actually happens. And I've seen in both IEEE and ACM journals, articles that have been retracted because of practices of self-citation, and where two people agree to cite each other's papers as often as possible to jack up their indexes. And they've been punished by having their papers removed.
I won't mention any names, but I remember once one colleague referring to another and said, well, he's a great scientist, but he's also mastered the idea of the smallest publishable unit. So instead of one big paper, he would have 3 papers. right.
Mhm.
That's another way to do it.
Part
Yeah.
1, part 2, part 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
So,
the other trick is you write a paper which contains something that's really wrong, and you get it past the referees. You made a mistake there, and it gets cited 100 times, and because of this, to be refuted.
Or you can write an erratum and get people to cite.
Oh yeah, that's a good one too.
And they're
yeah, or,
Yeah.
or you could be the head of a laboratory and insist that your name go on everything.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it does vary between fields. That's certainly the case. But even within a field, it's not really comparable because, even within, say, a very narrowly defined field, there are subjects which are worked on by big collaborations and then things which are worked on by smaller teams and so on. But also practices vary from place to place. I remember someone telling me, well, I didn't really contribute anything to the paper, but I think my name should be on it because the people who distribute the grant money will see how many papers my grant produced, and I'm using that grant money to fund the students. So, even if he thought that the idea was sort of morally wrong, he has to play along because that's what the system expects. And other people are more relaxed and say, well, I'll just leave my name off and put my student's name on it to help him start his career. And you have the absurd situation that in Romania, the wife of the dictator Ceausescu was a chemist, and she was on every chemistry paper in the country. Yeah.
Yeah.
It didn't save her.
Yeah.
Pardon?
It didn't save her.
Yeah.
Didn't save her in the end. That's true.
At some point that will be no one, I guess. So
I could interject here.
but
Barbara
maybe,
Beaton.
So let me say something that hasn't. Well, I think it's important, which is that giving the author credit. And what's happened now is that there are something called ORCID. I don't have an ORCID ID, I should get one. But ORCID is a way where you can have academic IDs so that, yes, I'm Jonathan Fine, but...
which one, yeah?
Which one,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can say, well, I'm that one. And here's the ID, and here's the URL that tells you which one it is. So the publishers are very keen that their journal articles are properly referenced, but it's quite difficult from a journal article, unless you know the area, to know exactly which person it is that wrote it, just from the author name.
Right. Yes, and ORCID IDs are another thing I've been trying to find and include, not in the general journal bibliographies because publishers rarely include that information in the metadata, but in the author-specific bibliographies, I put them in wherever they're available. They have one flaw. They can only be assigned to living authors. So we can't give Albert Einstein an ORCID ID. And for people with common names like John Smith and many Chinese names, I've read that China has only about 300 different family names in a country of 1.5 billion people. It is a big problem to disambiguate authors, and ORCID ID is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Do you know why it's restricted to living people?
It's probably described on their website as to why they did that, but it's something that's needed for, in our own field of tech.
Yeah,
consider D.E. Knuth. That could be Donald E. Knuth, but it could be Dennis E. Knuth, who's another much younger computer scientist. Mm-hmm. And when journals abbreviate the names to initials, they're both D.E. Knuth.
Yeah.
I read a paper last week, or preprint, and had a footnote in the bibliography, which is certainly a no-no for any automatic processing. Its purpose was to talk about some confusion regarding the author's name and the paper that was the title of the paper being referred to, which so its purpose was to sort of correct some misunderstandings. So it was a sort of wholesome purpose. And this part of the problem, I think, is the problem of equality, by which I mean to know certainly and unambiguously whether two things are the same and two things are different. Is this the same paper that the other author is referring to, or is it a different paper? Is this the same author? Is this the same journal, or is it a different journal? It's the sort of problem of equality, which is actually an important problem from a mathematical point of view, because mathematicians sort of take a large space and define relations on it and say that's what we mean by equality. So equality for them is an equivalence of sorts. But I've lost my thread. I've stopped.
Equality of things.
And again, that's where ISSNs and CODEN, C-O-D-E-N, that's the American Chemical Society's abbreviation system, was started long before the ISSN system. That helps. I've actually encountered instances of journals with very similar names, Journal of X and Journal on X. If you take a journal like J Chem Phys, which in my field of quantum chemistry was Journal of Chemical Physics, that could be Journal of Chemical Physiology, Journal de Chimie et Physique, and probably a number of other alternatives. So it's unfortunate that the chemistry and physics field have had a very long history of extreme abbreviation of literature references, often just an author name and an initial, very short abbreviation of the journal and a page number and a volume, but no title information and often not a complete author list. That also makes tracking things down hard. I was just going to interject a point earlier about the problem of author credits. Barbara Beaton and I had been recently discussing over email the problem of long author lists, and I searched my 1.6 million archives and found a couple of instances of over 1,000 authors. But I had heard that there was an even longer paper, and I tracked it down. It was a paper on the announcement of the Higgs boson. It has 5,300 authors, and it's something like 9 pages long just to list the authors.
In mathematics, there's something called polymath projects, which was set up by Terry Tao and Tim Gowers, who were eminent combinatorialists. And there, the author is Fred Polymath. And the idea is that it's a big team effort. And I don't know if the actual authors are actually listed at all or not. And they're very good for certain particular problems where you need a wide range of techniques to reduce a constant from 0.7 to 0.5. That sort of problem. But it's an important reduction. And there you have large numbers of authors. I think pieces of software have large numbers of authors.
Just a quick remark about journal names. Of course, there are some bogus journals which are intentionally modeled on serious journals because, well, somebody pays to publish stuff there. Yeah, there's a journal called Science and Nature, for example, which is completely yeah. And so people can say, well, I've published in Science and Nature.
Yes.
And there are many journals which have names intentionally similar to more popular journals and to more serious journals. And there's a whole industry of bogus journals, and some of them will literally print random text. It's purely automated, and for a fee, they will publish. Someone submitted an article and said, this is just to demonstrate that you will publish anything, and it was repeated like 1,000 times, and they published it. Yeah. And then there are, some journals which sort of go through the motions of peer review, but actually they'll publish anything which is not, obviously absurd. There's a whole range here, and many of the titles are intentionally ambiguous. And the hope, of course, is that people will mistake them for the real thing. I just put a link in the chat to Archive with X, which is a large preprint server. They recently had an announcement about their name change policy, which will probably cause some confusion. Yeah, I think the background is maybe people who change their names for various reasons, and so on, and that can certainly be confusing. And some journals said, well, we generate the stuff on the fly from Crossref, and if it's updated at Crossref, it's fine. But if you've read a paper and Smith and Jones 82, but now it's Smith and McDonald 82, really don't see the point. It seems that they're sort of disadvantaging themselves in terms of a degree of fame through the literature, so to speak.
Yeah, I do know of a women who, after one case of a woman who got divorced, changed her name, and so there were announcements in this journal that her new name was this, and that was the same person as it was before.
If you make that announcement,
I would say a woman should always use her maiden name as her professional name.
Yeah. I mean,
and I've run across things like that too. I know a woman who her real name on their office door was this, but her published name was something different, was her maiden name.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of things to throw in that of a different nature. The first is the fussiness of publishers regarding how things are formatted. I think they've got every right to be fussy as long as they pay for
it. Well, yeah, the consequence is they have to provide the bibliography style file and adhere to it.
And I think you were saying that physical review paid for work to be done for the tools.
Yeah.